I'm Tony Northrup, and this is our mirrorless 4K shootout. We've got the Samsung NX1, the Sony a7S with the Shogun, and the Panasonic GH4. This is our dynamic range test. That's why I'm holding a black umbrella and it's not raining. We've got the sun behind me to create very contrasty conditions, and this is a little bit complex because all these cameras have some low contrast setting that allows for greater dynamic range to be captured in the videos. But the Sony is actually pretty unique. It has S-Log2, which captures always at ISO 3200 and captures this huge dynamic range. So the other cameras don't quite have that, so it's a little tricky to try to match them up to see which can grade the best. So we started out at ISO 100 and 1/640th of a second. Now let's make that a stop slower so they gather a little more light. This is 1/320th of a second, so these cameras are gathering twice as much light as they were in the previous cut. So now we'll drop down another stop. Here's another stop brighter. It's also worth noting that because the Sony requires the Shogun to be attached, it costs a couple of $1,000s more than the other two cameras, which can record 4K internally. That's a huge difference. That means with this NX1 and the GH4, they're much easier to handhold and just carry subtly in public places. Let's bring it up another stop. We decided to leave the Sony at 1/320th of a second because it's always operating at ISO 3200 when you have that S-Log2 picture profile enabled. So it's actually much more sensitive, but it's still gathering light at what would be ISO 100 or ISO 200, if that makes sense. Stop here. Now the exposure for the sky is pretty closely matched, and you can see I've graded parts of the video to better expose my face. Pulling up the shadows looks better on the NX1 than the GH4, which makes sense given its bigger sensor. The S-Log on the a7S clearly grades the best, however. The Samsung and GH4 have a base ISO of 200, so we were using that and we're now down to 1/80th of a second. We'll bring it up another stop. Now we've got the Samsung and the Panasonic at 1/40th of a second, so they're letting in more and more light. The Sony is settled in at 1/320th of a second in ISO 3200. Another important functional difference between these cameras is the Samsung and the Panasonic have touchscreens, allow you to kind of touch to focus. We'll check that out more a little bit later. The Sony, however, does not have a touchscreen, which means if you're going to focus while you're recording, you're going to have to do some focus pulling, a little more complex. Let's bring it up another stop. Now we're at f18 and 1/30th of a second on the Panasonic and the Samsung. Stop again. At this point, the NX1 and GH4 start to look better than the a7S, but that's because they're exposed for the foreground and don't require as much grading. You can't see much of the sky in this example, but the a7S still shows plenty of detail in the clouds, while the NX1 and GH4 have the skies completely blown out. Remember that this is a test of dynamic range, and the a7S has clearly won. We'll test quality at different ISOs later. Now to test the focus tracking, we have each of these at an equivalent of around 200 millimeters in continuous focus. And hopefully as I'm walking, they're keeping up with me and tracking me. This is the kind of thing that's going to be important if you're shooting sports or even just candid kind of run and gun style operations. If you have a separate focus pull, that's great, but not everybody does. Giving it another pass because everything deserves more than one chance, right? The Samsung here has phase detect autofocus, which in theory should really help it, especially because the lenses are designed for that kind of thing. The GH4, not so much, and the Sony, not really at all. In fact, the Sony only has contrast focusing, and as a still camera, the focusing system is kind of a pain to use. We're giving the Sony a third chance because last time it didn't seem to do very well, so this time Justin's actually manning it and working the shutter button and hoping that that helps it keep it in focus. It should track automatically. It just didn't seem to be the case. Note that the panning was done in post-processing. The NX1 clearly won this test, doing a far better job of automatically tracking my walking. Any frame we pause on, the NX1 has me in focus. The GH4 came in second place. It did a decent job, maybe even passable, but the focus wavers in and out visibly. The a7S did a terrible job of focusing, even though we carefully placed the focus point on me, and even though Justin manned the a7S and tried to keep it tracking. If you shoot with the a7S, you'll need someone pulling focus. I did a quick rolling shutter test and measured the angle with a digital protractor. They all measured within a degree of 82, so they're all about the same. And none are as good as a proper video camera with a global shutter. This is our ISO test. Now all the cameras are at the base ISO of the GH4, which is ISO 200. The Samsung and the Sony could go lower, but we actually don't see too many differences at the low ISOs. And what that means is if you're a studio videographer, if you're adding all the light you need and working at the camera's base ISOs, it doesn't matter that much. Where ISO performance begins to matter is at the higher ISOs. Here we are at ISO 400, and I've done my best to grade the video to look pretty similar because I don't want differences in color spaces and such to make that big of an impact on how you see the final videos. Now, let's talk a little bit about whether you want to go to 4K or not, because it's a pretty big decision and it can be pretty expensive for you. And first and foremost, we wanted to move to 4K for the ability to crop in our 1080p videos, because especially with a photography background, I'm used to working with, say, a 36 megapixel image file and then being able to crop it down substantially. Especially sometimes you'll even take a horizontal picture and be able to crop it to a vertical perspective. Maybe you decide to use it for a magazine cover or something. That cropping flexibility is really powerful. And if you're recording in 4K and publishing in 1080p HD, you can crop 50%. You can crop down tremendously, allowing you to make compositional choices in post and allowing you to do things like a nice slow zoom while recording. Now we're at ISO 800 and f8. Now not a lot of people have 4K TVs, and so some people say, hey, if nobody has a 4K TV, why would I want to publish things in 4K? And my first response would be, how long do you want your video to exist? If you want your video to have a lifespan of only a month, something like a camera review, for example, doesn't have a real long lifespan, it might not be worth it at all. But if you want your video to be around for a couple of years, 5 years maybe, then if you look back, the experience you'll have is going to be similar to the experience that you have now watching old SD videos. Go back and watch, something Seinfeld, and the resolution just looks terrible on your HD TV. And for one, we do want a lot of our videos to have a longer lifespan. So for me, that's a good reason to record, edit, and publish in 4K. Here we're at ISO 1600, and this is where the GH4 has started to fall off in my previous experience, and the Sony a7S still looks pretty clean. Talking more about 4K, the 4K has a lot of costs that you might not factor in right away. First, storage. The file sizes get to be pretty tremendous. It's storing about 4 times more data, and you can expect your file sizes to grow about 4 times from your standard HD. This also impacts your computer's performance. So you'll basically need a more powerful computer, or you'll need to do what we do, which is to use an offline editing process where you receive the files, transcode them into a lower quality format like 1080p highly compressed, and maybe something that's easier edited like a ProRes format. Do all your editing, and then during the final stage of encoding and publishing it, you'll actually go back and pull in those original files so that you can render it in full quality. Another factor when choosing between these cameras is going to be the lens selection, because they all have different formats. The Sony is full frame, and because it's mirrorless, you can put on an electronic adapter, an intelligent electronic adapter that allows you to put on full-frame Canon lenses, retaining control of the aperture and getting image stabilization. Sony also has a pretty decent lineup of native lenses for the E-mount, but that lineup doesn't come close to matching the GH4's Micro Four Thirds lineup, which is absolutely spectacular. You can get Micro Four Thirds lenses for just about anything. But if you have existing full-frame lenses, or you kind of want that full-frame experience, if you put them on your GH4, you're going to be getting a 2.3x crop factor, which is basically ruins lenses. The pixel density is far too much for most lenses. Now there is an option. There's a Metabone speed booster, which gives you a 0.71x crop factor. So you multiply that 2.3x times that 0.71x, and it all becomes very complex, but it's basically similar to like a Super 35 format. The Sigma 18 to 35 in the Nikon format with the Nikon to Panasonic or Nikon to Micro Four Thirds speed booster works really well and gathers a whole lot of light. Now, the other end of the scale is the Samsung, which has a very limited native lens selection. And while you can adapt lenses, all of the adapters are dumb adapters. So you would lose any sort of electronic aperture control over them, and you wouldn't be able to get any image stabilization. So before you jump into the Samsung world, make sure you can get or adapt lenses in the way that you need and that they're equally functional. Here we are at ISO 6400. ISO is closely related to lens selection, because if you can get a lens that's f1.4, then you're gathering 4 times more light than you would if the lens were f2.8. So instead of shooting at ISO 1600, you'd be shooting at ISO 400. So if you're not happy with, say, the GH4's performance at these higher ISOs, take a look at the lens selection, because if you can get a fast prime that gathers more light than something comparable for the a7S, then you might still be able to get comparable results. This is ISO 12800, and it's only native on the Sony a7S. The other two cameras max out at ISO 6400 for some reason I can't quite explain, because they are actually very pushable. And I've done this before with the GH4. When I need to shoot at ISO 12800 but it doesn't have it, I just underexpose it by a stop and then pull it back up in grading. So that's what I'm going to be doing as we continue to shoot with the a7S in lower and lower light. This is ISO 25600. Now, another difference between these three cameras is that the GH4 and the NX1 will both record 10-bit color if you use the HDMI out. The a7S will only record 4K when you use the HDMI out. However, it only records 8-bit color. Now, we did this whole complex test using the GH4 to try to determine if going to 10-bit color was worth it. And while we did like using the external recorder with it, we really didn't see any differences in the color depth. But maybe you know that there are some, or maybe you need it for broadcast capabilities. In that case, it might be a consideration for you. But for us, 8-bit color seems to be giving us as much image quality as we could discern, even with heavy grading. This is ISO 51200. Talk a little bit about the usability of the cameras. The GH4 is definitely the most usable of the three cameras. Panasonic has this long history of making excellent video cameras. The touchscreen works great. It flips out from the side, which makes it really easy to flip it around and see yourself filming, or to hold it above your head or down low. All the buttons are exactly where you'd expect them to be. The a7S comes in second place for that. It does not have a touchscreen. It tilts, but it doesn't flip out. And also, I just find the controls and menus to be a little more clumsy than the GH4. In last place is the Samsung, which is quirky and a bit flaky at the moment. There are little usability problems, like when you connect it to an HDMI out, the menus completely stop working until you unplug it. However, Samsung has released several firmware updates, and usability is a thing that they can improve with future firmware updates, so I totally expect them to fix those quirks. Here we are at ISO 100,000, and of course the Samsung and GH4 are being pushed hard at this point. They're probably looking pretty bad. In fact, the Sony probably doesn't look that great either. In my previous test, I found the GH4 to be about 3 stops worse than the Sony, which means at this point it should be pretty unusable. I will also add that the Samsung ran out of batteries. Well, they all ran out of batteries at some point, but the Samsung allows me to charge via USB cable, which makes it really convenient. We have it hooked up to USB now, so even though we only had the one battery, it's able to keep going. Thanks, Samsung. Here we're at ISO 200,000. I know, we're pushing it far. The Samsung has a couple of really nice features. For example, I needed to update the firmware, and it allows me to do it using Wi-Fi. I don't have to connect it to a computer at all. I connected directly to my home's Wi-Fi network, and it downloaded it from the internet. On the other hand, the Sony also needed a firmware update, and I tried 4 or 5 times using their stupid app, and it wouldn't connect to the camera, and it just wouldn't work until I just gave up. What a pain. The GH4 is somewhere in the middle. You just load the firmware update on the memory card and it works just fine. Anyway, Samsung, being a mobile phone company, tends to have the advantage on these sort of like technology-based features, so I have a lot of hope for them as a whole company. Here we are at ISO 409,000 for the Sony. Again, this is higher than you'll probably ever need to use, but sometimes it's nice to know that it's there, and if you just need to strictly document something like Bigfoot or UFOs, here we are at a virtual ISO 800,000. Even the Sony doesn't support this, but we're pushing it, and you can still definitely make out some image, but we're not done here. I'm going to push it just a step further, just to experiment with what ISO 1 million might look like. ISO 1.6 million, heavily pushed on all 3 cameras. This pretty much wraps it up. Just wanted to see what it looked like. So now let's summarize it and kind of pick the winners for different categories of videography. For those who don't know, this is Justin Eckert, our cameraman and producer, and he spends more time actually filming with these cameras than I do, so I wanted to make sure we got his opinion on everything. Before we start, I wanted to plug sdp.io/tutorials, a URL you can visit to get hands-on tutorials for a lot of these cameras. We have a tutorial for the GH4, which might not be up yet, but it'll be up soon. And there's a tutorial for using the A7. Anyway, we keep expanding this for new cameras, so if you already have one of these cameras, or once you get them, check out that link to learn exactly how to use it. Up first, what would you pick for action and sports? If somebody wanted to film their kids playing soccer or do professional sports videography?
As far as videography goes, I think this Samsung is the way to go. The phase detect focus, it just seemed to do a much better job than any of these other cameras, for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as far as filming during video, it beat every camera we've tried, including like the Canon 70D, which was always our go-to camera for that kind of stuff. It just tracked focus. But the Samsung just clearing away the best camera we've used for filming any sort of action.
Right.
It just nailed it. Every frame we stopped on, I was nice and in sharp and in focus. And in fact, for taking stills, it's been a really amazing camera. So so surprised to see a mirrorless camera do that well. How about for the casual filmmaker? Maybe somebody who's doing YouTube things, or they want to make a little zombie movie in 4K, but they don't have like a professional grade budget. What would you recommend?
I think the GH4 would probably be ideal in most circumstances. As you know,
any particular reasons?
Well, their lens selection.
Yeah.
Their lenses are affordable. I think you might struggle to find the same lenses or resale value in either of these other cameras, although the Sony has a pretty good selection at this point now too. But
yeah, if you want to do 4K stuff, I had to just quickly eliminate the Sony from the running for casual filmmaking, because you have to then get this big Shogun here, some sort of external recorder, and then once you add that, it becomes this like big heavy rig. And for that reason, I had to narrow it down to the NX1 or the GH4, and it was tough. I think they could each be a great video camera for the casual filmmaker, but you're right, Samsung just has a far more limited lens selection, and even their adapters aren't all that intelligent. And the lenses they do have can be more expensive than you can get for the GH4. For Micro Four Thirds lenses, they also have this wide variety of used lenses available.
They do.
And we buy pretty much all of our lenses used because they're just out there and for great prices. So I think bang for the buck for the casual filmmaker, the GH4. And if you decide to get one of these cameras, you can use our link down here, and we'll get a few pennies out of every dollar. Just helps pay for the videos and such. What about high contrast situations? If there's a sun behind the subject and you want to show the detail in the sky and the detail in the face?
Well, for high contrast situations, the clear winner was the a7S, but you would have to have the Shogun.
Yeah, and like $5,000.
Right.
If you have that, it could not be beat. The dynamic range was just a clear benefit if you are grading your videos. If you know how to use grading software and pull up the color and work with S-Log, you can squeeze way more out of the A7. These cameras both had flat profiles, and we were able to grade them. We were able to pull up the shadows a usual amount, but not nearly as much. This just had several stops more of detail down in the shadows that could be recovered. So the A7S wins that one, and I felt by just a really healthy margin. It just means if you're a filmmaker and you're working with a lower budget and you're using one of these other 4K cameras, then you need to control the lighting a little bit. You don't get to shoot with the sun right behind your subject. So if you love Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul and all those high contrast shots, you won't be doing that. You will just be working in flatter lighting and planning your day around cloudy days, or adding fill light or adding a diffuser or something.
Yeah.
What if you want some nice bokeh? What if you want to blow that background out?
The Sony's also a clear winner, obviously with the full frame sensor and lenses like that Metacon there.
Yeah, we've been using a lens nobody knows about, the Metacon Zhongyi 50mm f0.95. 50mm f0.95, full frame. And it gives you crazy, crazy background blur for, I think I just bought mine for $775. So
yeah, it was something
not
like
that much. And on the Micro Four Thirds, on the GH4 platform with 4K, you'd have to get like a 40mm f0.4 or something, and that lens doesn't exist. But any full frame lenses, Canon, Nikon, they can all be pretty well adapted to the Sony A7 platform. You won't be getting autofocus, but the autofocus on the Sony was terrible anyway.
Yeah. And
then you can throw on, basically, if you want background blur on the Samsung, you have an 85 f1.4, which would do a good job. APS-C, you have to apply that 1.5x crop factor, or the 50 to 150 f2.8. Now, for the GH4, we do have some awesome lenses that are good at blurring the background.
We do.
Like that, what is it, a 75mm f1.8?
Right.
And it's good, but it can't match these big full-frame lenses. So you can get the job done with these cameras. You can blur it a lot, but there's simply no beating the full-frame platform for background blur. Especially because you can also get more bang for your buck, because you have all these old full-frame lenses you can buy used and strap on there.
Yeah.
As long as you don't mind manual focus. So this seems like an obvious choice for anybody who just watched it, but what about low light? What would you go with?
Well, the Sony's winner, once again, with low light, it's just incredible.
Yeah,
Those high ISOs just really held up.
Yeah, pretty much everything ISO 3200 and above, the Sony was the clear winner. And in my personal experience, when you put on a lens like that Metacon f095, you can see in the dark. Just no exaggeration. There can be pitch black where I cannot see a thing with my eyes, and I look through the viewfinder and you can see everything around you. Incredible amounts of detail in full color. It's absolutely amazing. I would have thought the Samsung would have beat the pants off the GH4, because the Samsung sensor, the usable image area in 4K recording, is more than twice the size of that of the GH4. But we just didn't see any appreciable difference. The bigger sensor just didn't give us better image quality.
Yeah, it was negligible.
Yeah, the GH4 is kind of batting out of its league, really. It was 3 stops behind the Sony, roughly, but tied with the Samsung somehow. It just does an incredible job of whatever light it gets, it does an amazing job with it.
Yeah.
But the Sony's big sensor simply can't be beat, especially when you go back to what we were just talking about with all those big, fast, full-frame lenses you can get super cheap.
That's right.
And it's clearly the winner for low light. But what about all those people who say, I want to make videos, but I also need it to be a great stills camera. I can't afford 2 cameras. I want one camera that does everything perfectly.
As we were kind of talking about a little bit earlier, they're probably not, any of them are really great for still photography, but this Samsung really did an excellent job in the focusing tests we used it with.
Yeah, the Samsung is a really good stills camera.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is right. There's no perfect camera for both stills and video. We always grab different cameras for those things.
Right.
I love using the GH4 as a stills camera. It does 10 frames a second, and it has this silent electronic shutter that I like using, and all the buttons are just in the right place. And of course, the fantastic selection of micro four thirds lenses is great, but 16 megapixels is real low, and the base ISO of 200 doesn't give you like beautiful image quality, even in bright light conditions. The Samsung has a much bigger sensor, 28 megapixels, and the focusing system beats every other camera we've tested, really. The focusing system is fantastic in it. So overall, I think it's the best 4K video camera as a stills camera too, if you can get the lenses you need. The lenses are still really limited, so make sure, check it out, make sure you have the lenses you need and that the prices are fair.
Yeah, they can be pricey.
How much you're going to spend on the lenses and the body, and then compare it to the competitors. It might even be cheaper to get a separate camera at some point because the lenses can be expensive. The a7S, kind of a lousy stills camera in my opinion. It's low noise and all that, but it's only 12 megapixels, so there's not a lot of detail. And the focusing system is appalling. It's just so slow. It only has contrast focusing, so it's very slow and it hunts, and it's just frustrating to use. If you're doing manual focus and you don't mind the low megapixel count, then it's a fun stills camera to use, especially in low light, because you can do night photography and hold it up to your eye and see everything around you. But if you actually are making big prints, or you want to do a lot of cropping or any sort of tracking of motion, the Samsung is definitely going to be a better stills camera for you. That wraps it up. Just a quick plug for our books. If you're interested in photographic techniques, things like depth of field, lighting, mood, expression, storytelling, check out Stunning Digital Photography, which includes 9 hours of video and free lifetime updates. My Lightroom book here is great for post-processing of still photos, organizing your pictures, and doing some light editing. And of course, my photography buying guide covers all the details about what makes lenses different from each other and what things are worth spending more on for lenses and lighting and flashing and such. Get all those at scp.io/store. The ebooks start at under $10. And if you're unhappy with them, just let me know. Send me an email, tony@northup.org, and I'll give you your money back. If you have any questions, write us a comment down below, share with your friends, and don't forget to click subscribe. Thanks.